Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fanfiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and Accio headphones, and let the magic begin. Two Weddings and a Manhunt by Deydralinne, Chapter 17. September 20th, 2003. Sunlight filled the room with a warm glow. Hermione stretched her arms upward, her eyes fluttering open to look out the window beside her. Draco's arm lay across her, his hand tucking into her hip, his face buried behind her shoulder, the soft breaths indicating that he was still asleep, tickling her skin, and pressed against her thigh was his hardened length. She tried and failed to stop the smirk that passed over her face in amusement. She had come into his room last night with the intention of saying thank you for standing up for her, but had clearly fallen asleep. She found that she didn't mind waking up next to him this morning. It felt rather cozy to have his arm across her like this. The necklace he had gotten her for her birthday had touched her more than he could understand. It had been kind and considerate and thoughtful, and then last night he had been protective, and damn it all if watching him punching someone for calling her a bitch didn't cause tingly feelings in the pit of her stomach. She slowly turned to face him, tucking her hands under her cheek, his arm instinctively reaching around her back and readjusting his grip. He looked peaceful when he was sleeping, even despite the blue bruise on his cheekbone and his tousled hair. There were no subtle frown lines, no tightness pulling at his mouth, and she was forced to admit that her husband truly was blessed with good looks. She reached one hand out and traced a light feather line between his eyebrows down to the tip of his nose. His brow furrowed slightly and his nose crinkled in such a mild way that she couldn't help but smile and do it again. She was on the third line of his nose when his arm that was still thrown over her tightened, yanking her closer to him and closing what little space there had been between him. His eyes flew open as hers grew wide. She expected to see surprise on his face, but instead, he looked at her with purpose, lifting himself onto an elbow and hovering over her. If you don't stop tickling my nose, I will roll you over, sit on your thighs, and tickle your feet, he growled, his voice deep and low. A small shocked laugh escaped her at the absurdity of it. Another growl from his chest filled her ears, and that tingling in the pit of her stomach twisted sharply. Draco dropped his forehead against her shoulder. "Please don't wiggle like that," he whispered. His erection jumped to the forefront of her mind, her lips parting in a silent "oh." But Draco's arm was still tight against her waist. He had made no move to roll away from her, so she decided to test a theory. Perhaps she hadn't been the only one to feel the difference in their dynamic lately. She grinned. "Do you mean like this?" rolling her hips in a slow manner that purposely rubbed against his length. His breath hitched ever slowly, lifting his head to look at her. "Hermione," he warned, an undertone of pleading in his voice. She batted her eyelashes and feigned innocence. He might have believed her if not for the cheeky grin on her face. "Draco?" She rolled her hips again, a playful sparkle appearing in her eyes. "Don't start something you're not prepared to finish." His eyes were dark as he stared down at her, fingers gripping her ribs tighter as he rolled her further onto her back, his face hovering above her, pushing himself harder against her hip involuntarily. "Who said I wasn't prepared to finish it?" Her voice came out in a breathy, quiet confidence. His hand slid down her ribs, lower past her waist, fingers dancing over her hip and coming to grip firmly at her thigh. "I mean it, Hermione. If you start this, I won't want to stop." There was a tone in his voice that made her think he meant more than right now in this moment. Her heart fluttered against her chest and she reached up behind him to run her finger through the back of his platinum hair. "So then don't stop," she whispered, fear that he would roll away from her squeezing in her chest, while a hot need burned at her core. He let out a shaky breath, eyes calculating her face, checking every tiny expression for doubt. When he found none, he let out a small groan and dipped his head to hers, capturing her lips against his in a bruising passion. His hand by her head pushing into her hair, pulling her closer to him. He ground himself against her hip again, moving from her mouth to her jaw, then to her neck, his tongue flicking over her sensitive flesh before sinking his teeth into her neck in a way that straddled the line of pain and delectability. A small moan bruised past her lips. her back arching upward slightly. "Please, Draco," she keened beneath him, a pleasing sound that made his cock twitch. His hand moved back upward, pushing the baggy shirt she had changed into last night higher, his head ducking down and capturing a taut nipple between his teeth. The feel of his hot tongue rolling over her sent shooting shocks straight to her core. His hand, which she had only now realized was huge, framed the underside of her breast, as his mouth sealed over her, and a pressure rose as he sucked her nipple further into his mouth. His hand began to retreat further south again, pushing her pajama shorts down with him. A deep groan rippled through him at the realization that beneath her shorts she wasn't wearing any underwear. He lifted his head to peer down at her again with those dark eyes of his. "You slept in my bed last night without underwear?" Truth be told, she really hadn't meant to fall asleep in here, but right now she felt nothing but glad that she did. She gave a shy nod. "You're going to be the death of me, I swear." He dipped his head again, giving her a lingering kiss. He rolled himself to hover above her, his arms on either side of her ribs holding him up. Her eyes fluttered as he began to trail of kisses down the side of her neck again, carrying further south, light kisses all the way down her stomach and veering off to trace down her thigh. He pulled away from her. She hadn't even opened her eyes when his hands gripped her behind her knees and yanked her further down the bed. A delighted squeal rushed out of her. Hermione could feel the power rolling off of Draco, and in that moment, she opened herself up to the feeling of safety that came with it. Her eyes glued to him as slowly he lowered himself to his knees at the foot of her bed, his eyes never looking away from her face. The pleasure of seeing this man kneel for her made her head spin. The sight of him settled between her legs, causing her heart to race. His hands pushing her thighs further apart with a firmness that somehow was just as gentle, sent electric shocks through her. Hermione fought the need to tremble beneath his touch. He hadn't even touched her yet, and she was alight with the feeling of pleasure running through her veins. "Hermione, you are exquisite. Do you know that? Look at you, already glistening for me," Draco breathed out in admiration. His hands roamed up and over her stomach, her heart threatening to break through her chest at his praises. His hands tenderly traced back down and came to rest at the inner part of the backs of her thighs, lightly pulling her open further for him to see. That growl in his chest was back, and it hit some primal part of Hermione's soul. There's a look of desire and appreciation in Draco's eyes that had her wanting to push closer to him. She was thankful that he took the hint because he looked at her again, pure delight in his eyes before lowering himself to her, placing a tender kiss above her clit that caused a small whimper to release from her. Hermione felt him smile against her, placing another kiss only fractionally closer. She tried to wiggle her hips, but his hands were holding her too firmly in place. Draco made a tutting sound. "Patience, pet," he smirked, resuming his agonizingly slow kisses. A gasp sounded as his lips finally connected with the bundle of nerves. His tongue slid against her clit, and Draco growled again in delight. "Fuck, Hermione, you taste incredible." His breath against her center and sent goosebumps over her skin. His tongue licked up and over her entrance and resided once more at her clit. Hermione looked down to see Draco's eyes fluttering closed as she was hit once more with a sharp shot of electricity. How could a man as powerful as Draco be making her feel so powerful right now? Between them, she could feel the surge of magical energy in the air around them, sparking and threatening to set fire to everything and burn it to the ground. Draco's mouth immediately closed around her clit again, and he sucked on it, rolling his tongue over it while he did. She could hear herself panting as waves of pleasure rolled over her. She could hear herself moaning with delight, but she was too lost in the feeling he was causing her to care. One hand left her thigh, and a second later, one of his fingers was sliding with ease into her, curling to hit that sweet spot inside of her that had her grasping at the sheets below her. His other hand no longer held down her thigh. Instead, he had snaked it around and it splayed across her hips, pinning her further into the mattress. She could feel her arousal coating his hand as he continued to slide his finger in and out of her. His enjoyment was clear when he growled at her every moan, every gasp, every flutter of pleasure that was mounting at a rapid pace within her. Hermione no longer felt like she could breathe as he continued to suck at her clit, lashing at it with his tongue. She arched her back in an attempt to gasp at more air. Draco dipped another finger into her, curling to hit the same sweet spot. The crescendo was right within her grasp when he ripped it away from her. Involuntarily, she groaned in frustration, but he was looking at her with eyes like a dark storm. She could barely recognize him beneath his lust. "Tell me you're mine, Hermione," he growled possessively. Her head still spinning from the heaven she had been in just seconds ago. Her voice was lost, and all she could do was nod. "No, be a good girl and use your words. Tell me you're mine." "I'm yours, Draco. I'm all yours," she managed to whisper through the fog settling in her brain. Draco hummed, pleased with her answer, glided his tongue over her once more, lapping her up like a man dying of thirst. His fingers slid through her to reclaim their place as his mouth closed over her clit again. With ravenous vigor, Draco sucked at her, pressure building hard and fast, yanking at the coil within her. She was distantly aware of how loud her cries of pleasure, whimpers of his name, had become, but the rest of the world had ceased to exist. His fingers worked her core, moving faster as he stroked against that pleasure center. His growls of enjoyment vibrated her. "Come for me, Hermione. Show me what a good girl you can be, and come for me." He rushed out against her before his tongue lapped at her bundle of nerves again, sucking and pulling. It would be impossible for her to resist doing what he was asking for her, even if she wanted to. The band had already snapped. Her eyes rolled far back into her skull, and all sound faded to nothing, as her core clenched painfully around his fingers. It felt as if her soul had left her body. Hermione gasped for air, and suddenly she was whooshing back. She could hear Draco mumbling pleased praises against her as he slowly drank her up, guiding her softly through the other side of her orgasm. Her heartbeat felt impossibly fast. Draco leaned over her again, pressing soft kisses to her forehead and brushing stray strands of hair away from her face. "Hermione, darling, are you with me?" Her body felt like it had been set on fire, but she nodded against his lips. "Good, you did so well." His body stiffened above her briefly. She swore she could feel him breathing in her. When he spoke again, his voice wasn't drenched in lust. There was now a subtle hint of fear. "I told you to tell me that you were mine. I want you to know that I meant that. I'm not holding you to your answer. I don't want you to say anything right now, not when you're still on the high of that endorphin rush. But nothing else can happen between us, Hermione, until you mean it. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue and tell him that she did mean it, but she knew there was no point right now. And deep down, she thought that perhaps he was right. Maybe the fact that she just had the best orgasm of her life was clouding her judgment a little. Doubtful, but was a possibility, so instead she nodded silently. "Good." He placed another kiss on her forehead before pulling away from her, and Hermione found out that she immediately missed his presence. Sudden embarrassment hit her like a truck. "Oh my God, Draco, your mom!" She buried her face in her hands in shame, removing them to glare at him when she heard him chuckling. "Don't worry, after the Theo-Daphne incidents a few weeks ago, I put permanent silencing charms on all the bedrooms. And also because I don't know if you know this," he said with a smirk from where he stood at the end of the bed, "but you're not exactly quiet with your self-love either." Mortification hit her as she realized that he would have heard her taking care of herself the first night they had slept here in the penthouse. He chuckled at the sight of her reddening cheeks. "Hermione, don't get me wrong, I found it sexy as hell, but I didn't think you would want me listening to it. We should head down, though, before she comes looking to wake us up." He handed her pajama shorts that had been discarded earlier. She nodded, and after getting dressed again, followed him downstairs. Narcissa was busy in the kitchen assembling an array of pastries onto a platter, awkwardly avoiding looking up at them. On the counter next to her, Hermione could see a paper bag with the logo of a bakery down the street on the front. Horror flooded her system at the realization. "I thought you said you silenced the rooms," she hissed quietly at Draco under her breath. Draco raised an eyebrow. He did, dear, but there was no mistaking that level of magical power, and that is not something anyone's mother wants to be present for or discuss. So shall we move on to discussing the events of last night instead? Narcissa turned and looked at the two of them with a raised eyebrow, tutting when she saw the scratches still evident on Hermione's face, and the bruise still on Draco's cheek. Hermione swallowed.